And we'll explore some of those together today. And I hope that you'll add questions. And I'm hoping, Sophia, if I don't see the chat, you'll let me know if there's something to stop and be able to talk about as we go along.
Yeah, I'll do that. And also, if people want to just save their questions till the end, we can take like 10 minutes or so to talk about that at the end.
Okay. Either way is fine with me. Thank you. And let's see. Here we go. I'd like to take a minute and just ask everyone to watch and to take a deep breath and think about the kelp, whether it's diving in the kelp or watching it. Take another breath in. That video was some of the amazing work of Maurice Roper, a cinematographer, who I think helped capture what it's like to be in the kelp, to be able to sway with the kelp as it moves, to look and see every time as it moves, there's something else that's exposed, something new to look at, to think about, to cause fascination. And even though I'm not there, I still think about what it's like, what it feels like to feel that kelp and seaweed move around me. When we think about the coast and we think about the lessons that are taught in so many ways, how do we develop that reciprocal relationship with nature? And that's something that I strive very hard to do and impart as I work with students of all ages. That if we think about not only what are the services that kelp provides us, that yes, as we take a deep breath, algae, the macroalgae, the larger algae of the ocean, are providing us a percentage of the oxygen that we breathe, of helping keep our air healthy and clean. They're a food source, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. But hopefully also as individuals, we're protecting the kelp. We're finding ways to help nurture its success and its growth. Historically, we've seen how it can be damaged with increased pollution or over collection. And so how do we manage that? And there's a couple of different ways that are happening both in forests with Department of Fish and Wildlife and the regulations for harvesting kelp or any seaweeds along the California coast. And also areas that are established to ensure the protection, like marine protection areas and national marine sanctuaries. Because as you've heard already, there's issues and concerns about the kelp and the monitoring work. I'm excited about who you've already heard and who you will be hearing as this series continues. Monitoring the kelp is really important to understand how this ecosystem is changing and to consider what we can do in making changes. One of the things I love about story time is having stories read to me and information shared. And so I'd like to share some passages from some of the books that stand out to me as we look at seaweed and look at kelp and other algae. This is from Josie Iceland's book, The Curious World of Seaweed, and it's referencing the Macrocystis porifera. These complex structures are the base of the vertical wonderland of an ecosystem. Understory kelp grows between the giant kelps, and all the algae oxygenate the surrounding waters. They're photosynthesizing machines that use CO2 to generate biomass and pump oxygen into surrounding waters at a rate unknown on our terrestrial world. Fish hide amongst the giant kelp fronds. Mollusks such as abalone and snails feed on kelp detritus that sloughs off, as do crabs and countless amphipods and isopods and small crustaceans. Hydroids and bryozoan colonies take up residence in the giant kelp's broad blades and stem, and fish nibble at these delicacies. Urchins are the most voracious kelp herbivore, able to attack the forest in hordes, but they are often just one of the thousands of organisms that thrive in this complex ecosystem that is the kelp amber forest. And others have compared the kelp forest to the redwood forest that we have on land. Oftentimes, these equating with what's more familiar with us helps us better understand what is happening in the ocean environment that is a little bit more distant. You need to feel comfortable in the water or comfortable with swimming with a mask or a snorkel or diving, as we saw in the video earlier. This is an amazing space, and probably one of my happiest places is to be in amongst the kelp. Never have I seen the same area the same way twice. And so the complexity of this ecosystem is always changing as well. And authors are really amazing at being able to share some of that with the rest of us. Most people, if they've encountered kelp, they've encountered it as wrack. And the wrack is what washes up at the high tide line. The wrack for some people is an annoyance. They think, oh, it's blocking my way to the water. It has flies, and those flies are going to do something bad. But in reality, they're a really important part of that ecosystem. And kelp serves a really important role as we go along and look at it. It connects the land and the sea where the seaweeds are. This literal area, it's an area that allows enough sunlight to penetrate. So we'll see where the kelp can go down up to about 200 feet, about 65 meters. Kelp influences life on shore, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And it's been used throughout time. You know, the first peoples that have been here for generations and generations, since time immemorial, they have respected and cared for the kelp and for the seaweed forests that are off our coast. And the reasons for that is recognizing that reciprocal relationship and how important it is to take care of what also takes care of you. When beach rock washes up, it ends up being super important. And some of the roles that it serves, it is a place where beach hoppers are burrowed in the sand underneath and hide below. And at night they come out and they feed on the kelp. And to watch in action, it's extraordinary how fast a beach hopper can just go right through the kelp. Rove beetles, non-flying beetles, also live there, coming out at night, feeding on the beach hoppers. So you can start seeing the food web that goes on in the beach rock that washes up. Mole crabs feed on the little pieces that break off and wash out with the waves as they go out. Round rays and corbina feed on those mole crabs. Again, the expansion of that food web that's happening in the ocean. The kelp that washes up, the seaweeds that are on the beach, they end up providing habitat for all organisms. It's just amazing. Kelp flies lay their eggs on the kelp, and then the larvae, as they hatch out, they end up feeding on the kelp. The kelp flies are fed on by swallows and by phoebes. Sadly, in some areas of the coast, the beach is still raked, removing this algae that's rich in nutrients to take to landfill. It is fewer and fewer locations that this is happening, fortunately, but it still occurs. And so it's a real challenge. By leaving kelp on the beach, we're seeing the beach ecosystem significantly healthier, leaving that beach wrack behind. In Southern California, most of the beach management agencies are now willing to not take beach wrack off of the beach during the grunion season because, again, it helps ensure the health of the beach. You might not think about kelp having a role in the health of the beach, but it absolutely does. When you look at sand, and gosh, I wish we could be out at the beach together to do this. When you look at sand in your hand, there's definitely those abiotic, the sand or the rocks and the cliff that's been broken down, but a lot of broken down biotic factors like dried seaweed that's left behind there. And to walk amongst the beach wrack, again, is something I love doing. You end up seeing this bouquet of colors muted because it's no longer underwater. But the greens of the ulva or the sea lettuce that's there, the stipes or the stem-like structures that help the kelp and the other algae be supported in the water, the pinks of the coralline algae, and obviously all kinds of birds, the little sandpipers that are coming through looking for food and foraging. I'm sure this artist wasn't able to capture a picture of those flies being eaten by some of the birds that come in, but the kelp flies breaking it down further. And this would be a morning, very likely during the winter, when we see sandpipers scurrying along the coast and foraging on our beaches. We're a really important part of the Pacific Flyway. What I'd love to share with you as we look at culture and ways that people connect to the ocean is, I went down this morning and I looked at what are the seaweeds that I can find there, what's going on, and I don't know if any of you, I know that at least one of our watchers taught science in school, and I don't know if you've done algae presses or nature presses. So here's an example of an algae press where someone collected the seaweed and pressed it. And this is something that any of us can do. If you go out to the ocean, go down to the beach, and you find algae, in this case, I'm going to try holding a paper behind it so you can see it more easily. This is, you can see the holdfast, and you can see what was growing up. This kelp. Kelps are one of are the algae that have these nematocysts, these floats, and the growing tip. And so there's one example. I'm going to try and find something that works better for you to all see this better. Maybe. Okay, you can see that. Let me take my screen off of a background and see if that helps. Thank you for your patience, and if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat now. I take off a background and see if that lets you see these seaweeds better. And yes, I'm getting a chance to smell the amazing algae right here that's in my tub. Okay, we can see some others that were washed up. Again, these were all washed up onto the beach this morning with some of the large swell that we've had in our area. I wanted to show you when algae first starts out, that holdfast that's attached to the rocks, hopefully it's found hard substrate to hold on to. If it doesn't, it can be pulled off quite quickly and easily. Here we can see the growing tip and the blades that are breaking off one at a time from that growing tip. One of the other types of seaweed I found was the feather boa kelp, and you can see the wide stipe that's there. I was hoping that I'd be able to show you a kelp limpet scar because kelp end up, there's a limpet that only feeds on kelp. Feather boa kelp, Egregia, is found along the coast near shore. And each of these floats helps it float to the surface, but structurally, it's made so that it can adapt and be closer to the surface. Some of my favorite algae to do algae presses are these little red algae. Leucamium, again, found in that understory of the kelp. When it breaks off and washes up onto shore, so do these as well. And lastly, one of the things I wanted to show you that was a wonderful discovery today was a horn shark egg case. And it was washed up right in amongst the kelp. It doesn't have a horn shark in it, in case you're worried. It is disguising to hide in the kelp. And so we think about adaptations where organisms can survive within an area. The horn sharks lay their eggs in the kelp, often twisting them into an area, and it hides, very effectively camouflaged until the egg hatches out. Sometimes with big swells, again, washing up onto the beach. With this little holdfast that I shared with you earlier, I see little shell bits of where it was holding on, probably helping illustrate how the holdfast serves as a really important role for all kinds of organisms to live in amongst the kelp. If we were to take one of these examples of seaweed in terms of an algae press, here's one that stands out to me right here. It's kind of interesting. It's flattened. It's got these wide blades, but not quite as wide as the macrocystis one that you can see distinctly on the screen, which is why I picked it out. What we would do in doing a press is we would lay it flat on a piece of paper. And once it's flattened, as you can see here, I would put a paper towel on top of it to help absorb the moisture. And this is going to flatten it without any question even further, but it'll absorb the moisture. The next thing I would layer is put cardboard underneath and cardboard on top. And then I would continue with additional algae that I might want to press and finish up by tying it in a press. In this case, I found a very inexpensive way of doing it. These little plant stands are tied together with oversized shoestrings. And so I'm always looking at ways that everyone can be able to afford and participate. And wrapping them around and tying it, and then at the end of the day, or the next day, I unwrap it, I put new absorbent towels, and I continue to layer and wrap till all of the algae has been pressed and it's all dry. Changing the paper every day, you can end up again with a press like this one. In this case, the press has both some brown algae, red algae, and some sea lettuce, ulva, one of the algae that's found throughout the ocean and the world, so all along the different shores. Really valued algae in terms of harvesting for food. And then you can make this into a card, you can frame it. I was sad I wasn't in my office to be able to share with you. I have a big framed kelp growing tip that I have often that I sit behind, that sits behind my chair. Walking along the beach just to look at and find what's in the rack helps you start imagining what's offshore, what's there to protect and to take care of. And there we go. As I said, algae lives in that intersection. It has to have light for photosynthesis. So most seaweeds are found especially the kelps between 6 and 35 meters of depth. But there's definitely nearshore algae, and we'll talk a little bit about those. They need to have a structure for attachment, and that's that holdfast. The hapra that's glued in place more effectively than most of the structures and methods that we have devised. That the natural world is incredibly effective. With the feather boa kelp I shared with you, the feather boa, the top of it will drop off, it will die after time, the hapra stays, and it continues to have new structures growing over it and new algae growing. So it can be quite old. The seaweeds trap moving particles and those nutrients break down and they benefit from the upwelling that's off our coast. Again, something that's very unique for this area. When we think about the edge of the sea, the tide can be low tide, like right now. Last night was an eclipse, or early this morning was an eclipse with the full moon that was gorgeous to look at. The tides are extreme along the coast right now. And as you go out at low tide, you'll find that the seaweed, like this rockweed, is just hanging limp. At high tide, water fills the pools, and you can be able to notice the algae moving back and forth in those pools. And Rachel Carson shared in her book, The Edge of the Sea, one of these laminarian holdfasts is something like the roots of a forest tree, branching out, dividing, subdividing in its very complexity, a measure of the great seas that roar over this plant. And so just thinking about that complexity, but I also wanted to share about the rockweeds. She wrote, when covered at high tide, the rockweeds stand erect, rising and swaying with the life borrowed from the sea. Then, to one standing at the edge of a flooding tide, the only sign of their presence may be a scattering of dark patches on the water close inshore, where the tips of the weeds reach up to the surface. Down below those floating tips, small fishes swim. Snails creep along the fronds, and crabs climb from branch to branch of the swaying plants. It's a fantastic jungle, mad in a Lewis Carroll sort of way. For what proper jungle, twice every 24 hours, begins to sag lower and lower, and finally lies prostrate for several hours, only to rise again? Yet this is precisely what the rockweed jungles do. When the tide has retreated from the sloping rocks, when it has left the miniature seas of the tide pools, the rockweeds lie flat on the horizontal surface in layer above layer of sodden, rubbery fronds. From the sheer rock faces, they hang down in a heavy curtain, holding the wetness of the sea, and nothing under their protective cover ever dries out. And again, the role of seaweeds along our shores, along our coast, is invaluable. They provide that habitat, and with the loss of them, we see a loss of biodiversity. The Snapshot Cal Coast is coming up June 11th through the 30th, and we're seeing changes in our coastline as the sea level is rising. We're seeing changes as people are harvesting more from our shorelines and trampling on many of the seaweeds that serve this really important role. One of the things we notice is in more protected areas, seaweed is able to grow longer, rockweeds especially, and where they've been trampled, they're much shorter and have less effect in that protecting of what's underneath. Kelp beds were essential in recognition of and establishing marine protected areas. So the law that went into effect in the late 1990s established the network or the reason for marine protected areas. Stakeholders worked extensively. Currently, Department of Fish and Wildlife and many different organizations are monitoring, and they're doing an assessment after 10 years. So during all of this year and into next year, they're looking at, have marine protected areas helped with biodiversity? Have they helped with ensuring whole ecosystems are protected? Not just the seaweed and not harvested too much, and not just the fish, not just the urchins, but everything is protected. And it'll be exciting to see what the results of those studies are. Definitely the issues of warming waters, of ocean acidification are having an impact. But we're also seeing kelp beds are helping buffer and address some of the challenges of climate change. They're slowing the water and helping reduce erosion impacts. And in recent research from Carrie Nichols, we're seeing that they're also ending up reducing the acidification in the water. And so there's so much more we have to learn about these areas. We've seen some of this with seagrass beds, and we're now seeing it more and more with kelp beds. I want to pause for a minute to see if anyone has questions. Or comments.
There's a question in the chat that asks, can those algae presses be done in the same way as flower presses? Is this
Yes,
process the same?
it's very, very similar, absolutely. And one of the things I've noticed is like you can also use handy wipes, which are those reusable cloths people sometimes use in the kitchen, and those are very absorbent as well. I can share directions and let you be able to post directions on how to do algae presses. There's several great resources that are available for that.
I'm wondering if you know anything about the starfish wasting disease. Is that going down?
There's been a lot of work that's been going on to monitor and to continue monitoring the recovery of sea stars. So we're seeing a decrease right now in the wasting, and we're seeing recovery. We're seeing more little sea stars in some areas, and we're also seeing in some areas where the larger sea stars went to deeper waters, they've moved back into shallow waters. But we're also seeing some areas where there's been no recovery at all. One of the most exciting things this last year in some of the marine, which is the multi-agency intertidal monitoring network, one of the most exciting results is that they found a sunflower star in one of their sampling sites. And the concern was that they have been totally wiped out because of the wasting disease. So it's hopeful, but we can't say that we're at all past the hurdle. And the worries are definitely there, especially with the tremendous amount of poaching and harvesting. Sea stars aren't allowed to be collected by individuals, but we're seeing people taking them from the rocky intertidal.
Is it the acidification that is causing, do they know what's causing the sea star wasting disease?
They do, and I'm sorry I don't have that link right here, but I will find it and share it. It is tied to, and I'm sorry if I can't remember if it's a virus or a bacteria. It's an infection that is triggered or exacerbated given the right conditions, and that seems to be when it's extra warm waters. So the warm blob that was in Northern California increased the efficacy of it wearing down the sea stars. Sea stars are incredibly sensitive to both temperature and pH in the water. And so as the water gets warmer and there's less oxygen, it makes it much easier for the disease to affect them. Great questions. And I'm sorry I
I have
don't
another question. Oh, sorry, did I interrupt someone?
Go ahead.
Okay. There's another question in the chat that says, Can you say a few words about the cultural importance of kelp to Indigenous peoples in California historically and today?
I can only say a little bit, and I think that that's something that's very important to have shared by people of Indigenous nations and along the coast. That it's part of an understanding and understanding the relationship between the coast and the ocean and Indigenous peoples who live there. It is, again, it's through partnerships with the Chumash where I've learned about that reciprocal relationship and have continued to gather guidance about how important it is that there's that respect and together working at taking care of an environment. And as you harvest from that environment, both being grateful for it, but also doing it in a way that's not going to damage. And so making really conscious decisions to help protect and to take care. Some of the early, and ongoing ways that kelp continues to be used is in cultural practices such as rattles, but also in food and in understanding what abundance a kelp forest provides, especially a healthy kelp forest. And I'm sorry I can't share more. I can certainly try and help make connections for someone who has that expertise. Other questions? There's a few more slides I have to share then. Yeah, kelp it's been harvested, or seaweed has been harvested for so many different ways. Definitely as a food. It is high in nutrients, it's high in minerals. In culture, it's been harvested and used, and as I said, as definitely in instruments, but in other ways as well. And I'm sorry I can't share more, but I will look into that. In art, like in kelp prints or algae presses. There's artists that use types of photography like Josie Iselin. And that's something that many people consider using. It has been harvested for generations and generations as a fertilizer because of the high level of nutrients. Seaweeds are harvested and have historically been harvested and used in packaging when shipping or transporting crustaceans like crabs and lobsters, as well as shellfish. It is a really important part of the waterfront economy. As we look around the nation and we see the diversifying of folks who are fishers and fishing families, when they're not out fishing for crab, growing kelp and doing aquaculture is a growing industry. We're seeing it up in Alaska, we're seeing it along the East Coast, and in some areas where it's just taking off on the West Coast. In terms of carbon sequestration, it's taking that carbon dioxide and it's producing oxygen. In some areas, they're testing growing kelp and purposely sinking that kelp to cause the carbon to go down to depth and to break down at depth. It's being harvested for biofuel, and the research that's happening through USC in partnership with industry is showing really positive outcomes, that by cycling kelp down to depth and bringing it up to the surface, it is being able to grow much faster, much more efficiently. And when we think about how much kelp there is in our ocean, less than 6% of our coast has kelp, or of our ocean itself is kelp and filled with algae. So it's a really precious area and resource. As I mentioned before, they provide tremendous nutrients, and they also guide people to where there is a wealth of other species for being able to farm or harvest sustainably, or to just enjoy and observe. Some of the examples of kelp that's being used as food, kelp pickles from Boa Kelp. Most people think right away of sushi or possibly of soup that has seaweed in it. Some, like me, might love seaweed salads. Or you can also get teas that are made from different types of algae. There's supplements that are available that have lots of different types of seaweed in them. I shared with a friend recently a tea that was sea lettuce, and it was combined into a tea to cool during the summer. There are cookbooks like this one, Ocean Greens, that let you see that seaweed, they see it as a vegetable of the sea, or sea vegetables, and it can be used anywhere from dressings to being cooked up as a salad or as an accompaniment with a meal. And they give a variety of different recipes that you can be able to use, including in pasta. And so today we've had a chance to look a little bit at some of those cultural connections. I will dive deeper and share more of the things that I didn't have with me today that sparked questions for many of you, and the important role that seaweed plays in the environment, and the relationship that people have with seaweed. Here you can see part of that project out at Catalina that USC has been involved with in looking at the growth rates of kelp as it's cycled to depth and back up to the surface. And I want to thank you for your time today. And I look forward to finding answers to some of your questions and sharing additional resources. And I'm hoping that Sophia and Maura, you can let me know if there's a space to be able to post those or to share them back with the folks who have participated in the session today. And is there anyone who still has questions?